Welcome to Dispatches, the official podcast for the Journal of the American Revolution. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Dispatches. I'm your host, Brady Kreitzer. Our guest today is author and JAR contributor Andrew Lawler, and he'll be discussing Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. Andrew, thank you for joining us.
Nice to be here, Brady.
Andrew, tell us a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, I'm a longtime journalist and a book author. I write a lot about archaeology and history, cultural heritage, from the Middle East to Africa to other parts of Asia. But recently I've been pulled into the rabbit hole of the American Revolution.
Well, we're happy to have you, Andrew. Andrew, tell us, if you could, a little bit about what made you want to write about this topic.
Well, I grew up in Southern Virginia, Norfolk, Virginia, which is an important city in discussing the American Revolution. And when I was a child, I thought I knew everything about the Revolution. It was pretty easy. In Virginia, you had Lord Dunmore, who was the last royal governor, who was the bad guy. He was the guy who was fighting against patriots like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. So when I was growing up, he was a villain also because he burned down my hometown. In fact, my grandparents would take me to the local colonial church that had a cannonball on the side of it that said fired by Lord Dunmore on January 1st, 1776. So there was proof that this was a bad guy. And I thought that was the end of the story until during the pandemic, I took my mother up to Williamsburg to get her out of her apartment. And while I was there, I bumped into some interesting facts about Lord Dunmore that I was not familiar with, mainly that he had created something called the Ethiopian Regiment. I had no idea what that was, had never heard the term. So when I started digging into it, I realized that there was a bigger story here that had been neglected or ignored when I was a child. And that put me on the path to finding out what really did happen during those important days in 1775 and 1776 in Virginia.
Yeah, Andrew, in your article, you really in the beginning lay out that it really wasn't common for Great Britain to arm the enslaved in the empire. Other empires had experimented with that. Could you talk about Britain's history with that?
Yes, it's a very short history. As you mentioned, others like the Spanish or the French often made use of enslaved people when they were fighting a war against their enemies. But the British were always wary of this, and there's only one or two minor instances where they drew on enslaved people to fight the Spanish, specifically down in the Caribbean. But for the most part, they were very afraid of doing that. They just didn't like the idea of putting guns in the hands of black men, basically, as opposed to other Europeans. And I think this really says something about the British attitudes toward enslaved Africans at the time. They were afraid of them.
In your article, Andrew, you mentioned that there will be some developments in Williamsburg that kind of change that dynamic, this need to arm the enslaved. Tell us kind of about that drama that began to play out.
Yeah, and to understand that, we have to go back a little bit. So Virginia was the largest, most populous, wealthiest colony of all the 13 colonies. And the royal governor was appointed by the king. In this case, King George III appointed a Scottish aristocrat, kind of a middling Scottish aristocrat named Lord Dunmore. And he came to Virginia in 1771, where he became one of the gentry. This was a tobacco growing colony where some 4 out of 10 Virginians were enslaved Africans. And the wealth mainly flowed up to the gentry in the form of revenues from tobacco. So Lord Dunmore became one of them. He bought enslaved people, he bought plantations, he became good friends with George Washington. They were really close buddies there for quite a number of years. And then the revolution began to happen. So you have the unrest that happens in New England beginning to spread to Virginia in the wake of the Boston Tea Party. So Dunmore was kind of caught in an awkward position because here he is, the governor, and his job is to keep order in this colony and certainly keep it part of the British Empire. But most of the British troops were in Boston, along with the British fleet. So Dunmore was faced with this difficult question of how do I combat the Patriots when I'm pretty much alone? He had a few dozen troops, but really, nothing that could stand up to the thousands of militiamen that the Virginia Patriots could put in the field by early 1775. And this all came to a head at what's called the Gunpowder Incident. So in April of 1775, in fact, this is just a day and a half after the battles at Lexington and Concord. Of course, in Williamsburg, they didn't know what had happened yet, no telegraphs yet. The news would not reach Williamsburg for a couple of weeks. But Dunmore decided to take the powder that was in the arsenal in Williamsburg, put it on a British ship. He did it secretly at night, hoping no one would notice. Of course, they did notice, and the Patriots then rushed to the palace. They were outraged. But instead of burning the palace or attacking Dunmore, a group of gentry went to his door, and they managed to get in and ask for an explanation. And the governor said, well, we all know that there was talk of a slave rebellion, so I took the powder to secure it so it wouldn't fall into the hands of the enslaved Africans. Now, you would think this is kind of an absurd thing, but in fact, the gentry believed it, and they left, and they calmed the crowd, and the crowd left. But a day later, Dunmore got word that one of his officers had been insulted in a street in Williamsburg, and he told a doctor who had come to make a visit at the governor's palace, he said, if anyone tries to harm me or my officers, I will reduce Williamsburg to ashes, and I will free the slaves. And this was a very radical pronouncement for a royal governor to make. A royal governor whose one of his primary jobs was to protect white Virginians from their enslaved property. So at that point, then things began to unravel.
Yeah. Could we talk about that, Andrew? I mean, realistically, what were Dunmore's, I think, ambitions? How did he see this playing out, arming the enslaved? And I think more importantly, what was the reaction across Virginia?
Right. Well, Dunmore had a very short-term goal, and that was to prevent armed patriots from storming the palace and taking him and his family. Because remember, his 6 children and wife were there in the palace. They were largely undefended since there were very few British troops. They were sitting ducks. So Dunmore's goal in these early weeks of unrest in Virginia was one thing only, and that is to prevent the Patriots from doing him and his family and the few redcoats that were there harm. So it was a pretty good strategy because in 3 cases, both of the gunpowder incident, and then there was an attempt by a Fredericksburg militia to attack Williamsburg. When they got news that he might free the slaves, they backed off. And then Patrick Henry himself gathered some forces a week or 2 later and attempted to march on Williamsburg. And again, that was repulsed. So Dunmore actually was very effective in using this as a short-term method to overcome the fact that he had very few trained troops. Because remember, Virginians, and when I say Virginians, I mean white Virginians who owned enslaved people. And they weren't just the gentry. There were quite a number of Virginians who owned maybe 1, maybe 2 slaves. They lived in utter terror and fear that one of their enslaved people would slit their throat at night, would poison them, would run away. So this anxiety that had been part of society for more than a century. So when Dunmore says these words, freeing the slaves, it really unraveled white Virginians. They were terrified that he was going to foment an enormous slave rebellion, which is exactly what he did.
Well, let's talk, Andrew, about this Ethiopian regiment. I mean, they proved themselves to be useful to Dunmore. What's the first time we really see them in action after this?
So Dunmore made his threat in April of 1775, but after that, he was very, very quiet. He did not free the slaves. He didn't talk about it again. It was clear that this was just a short-term attempt to turn back the Patriots. But by June of 1775, he's forced to flee Williamsburg. He ends up in Norfolk, which is the port city on the coast, really the only city in Virginia, a thriving and prosperous port at the time. And he was still faced with this problem of the Patriots were growing in numbers. He had very few troops, and the British, both in Boston and in Britain, refused to send him much in the way of additional reinforcements. They sent a couple of ships, a few men, but really nothing that could stand up against the thousands of patriots that were beginning to gather. So by November, it was really clear that an army was marching from Williamsburg to Norfolk with the goal of unseating Dunmore and dispersing, his opposition to the revolution. And Dunmore had very few troops. So at a very small skirmish that's called Kemp's Landing, the Battle of Kemp's Landing, everything changed. It was a small group of American militia that tried to ambush Dunmore and some of his loyalist troops. These included redcoats, these included white loyalists, and they also included black people with arms. These were enslaved people that Dunmore had taken in, had given them sanctuary from their patriot owners. And in that battle, there's an incredible moment that happens when one of the black militia, one of the black loyalists, member of Dunmore's troops, actually captures the white militia leader, who also happens to be his owner. And Dunmore was thrilled by this. And this really showed to him that these black men could fight, that they were brave, that they were capable. And within a short period of time, he released his Emancipation Proclamation on November 15th, 1775. This was the most radical document ever published in the United States prior to the Declaration of Independence. And he said, basically, if you're owned by a patriot, you come to me, I will grant you freedom, I'll give you arms, and I'll put you in the field after I train you. And that's just what he did. Hundreds of enslaved people, not just from Virginia, but as far away as Massachusetts, came to Virginia with this promise of freedom. He immediately formed the fighting age men into the Ethiopian Regiment with white officers who trained them. He gave them guns, gave them weapons. And within a matter of weeks, they had to use them because by then the Patriots were marching toward Norfolk and had arrived at a place called Great Bridge, a strategic crossing, which was the point of no return. Once you cross that bridge, basically you could get to Norfolk. And so it was a strategic spot that Dunmore hoped to hold, but the Patriot numbers began to increase. And soon you had these two armies basically facing one another across this bridge.
Yeah, Andrew, you're right about the battles of Great Bridge in your article as kind of a turning point in a lot of ways. Could you take us through those engagements?
Well, and I'm glad to hear you say the battles of Great Bridge, because it's often been called the Battle of Great Bridge. The final battle, which is the one that's famous that many people have heard of, in which primarily redcoats fought against the Patriots and were defeated quite soundly and forced to retreat. Now, what often doesn't get talked about are the many skirmishes that took place along the river prior to that final battle. And many of those skirmishes involved Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And they were fighting against white patriots. So it was the first time in American history you had armed black men fighting against armed white men, both seeking liberty. Both had the goal of liberty as the reason that they were fighting. The Patriots were surprised because they'd assumed that these black men would throw their guns down and run away, but in fact they didn't. They were quite aggressive. They were able to win a couple of these skirmishes, lose a couple of the skirmishes, but in the final battle, it was clear that Dunmore's forces simply could not hold back the Patriots, and eventually they were forced to retreat to Norfolk. They get on Dunmore's ships, the Royal Navy ships, along with the civilian flotilla, and soon you have some 3,000 people crammed on these ships in Norfolk Harbor, including not just the Ethiopian Regiment, but many of their families. Wives, children. There were many, many people. If you were black, you wanted to get the heck out of Norfolk because the Patriot troops were clearly not going to show you quarter. The Ethiopian Regiment members who were captured during the Battle of Great Bridge, by the way, were sent. They were not treated as prisoners of war, even though they wore uniforms and had guns. They were sent to the jail in Williamsburg, and many of them were then sent to a forced labor camp in Western Virginia, kind of Appalachian gulag, where they had to dig lead out of the ground to make Patriot bullets.
Andrew, tell us a little bit about the battle we see at Gwynn's Island. You read about that in your article. What's its significance?
So after Great Bridge, then you have this flotilla in Norfolk's Harbor. And actually, they created a land base just south of Norfolk there for a couple of months. And were a very formidable force. I mean, Dunmore was planning on attacking Williamsburg, which was a mere 30, 40 miles away. But the epidemics of smallpox and typhus took their toll, and eventually, in order to inoculate the Ethiopian regiment for smallpox, he had to find a safe place that the Patriots couldn't attack. So he chose Gwynn's Island, a small island, Chesapeake Bay. It was also about 30, 40 miles from Williamsburg, but to the north. And there he took this fleet along with the regiment members, along with white loyalists and redcoats. And there they set up a camp with this fortified base. It's a little too close to the mainland, as they discovered. And this is where the final battle was fought on July 9th, 1776. So just a few days after the declaration is signed. And in this, the Patriots were able to force the British and the Ethiopian regiment back onto the ships. And eventually, after a few weeks of tooling around Chesapeake Bay, they realized they had to go. They needed supplies. They were running out of water. So they finally made their way, most of them, to New York.
Andrew, what could you tell us about these men in the Ethiopian regiment after the war? What happens to many of them?
This is a great story. Now, people like Thomas Jefferson put out a lot of false claims. Jefferson said, Dunmore sold all of these people to the Caribbean, to the West Indies sugar plantations. In fact, that's not true. There may have been a few who were sold by some British officers, but we know that the vast majority of members of the Ethiopian regiment and their families, I should add, were safely evacuated to New York, just at the point where the British forces are attacking New York. So they actually took part in the Battle of Long Island. This is according to Virginia Patriot newspapers, by the way. And then they were absorbed into the British Army as part of the Black Pioneers. Now, that was a group that General Clinton, set up to have people to help do the engineering, that is, digging trenches and creating forts and doing a lot of logistics. So what's interesting is that Dunmore was the only senior British official who really treated the enslaved Black people as people. He gave them arms, he gave them respect, and I think he evolved over time. Although a slave owner, I think he realized that these people were in fact dedicated to liberty in a way that I think would have surprised the Patriots. And what's really interesting is that Dunmore, I think, because he came from a Scottish background, he was from the Scottish Highlands. He had actually participated in Bonnie Prince Charlie's Rebellion in 1745, which included a multi-ethnic army force. I think he really saw these Black Virginians as people who were worthy of being considered not just cannon fodder, as some historians have maintained, but as being serious fighters who were willing to risk torture, imprisonment, and death just by leaving their owners, even before they picked up a gun. So I think Dunmore over time really evolved and was able to see the value in these men that even a lot of later British leaders did not.
Okay, Andrew, so on this show, we always end with the same question. It really gets to the heart of what we do as historians. How do you think this article helps us understand the Revolutionary Era better?
Well, I should say that this article is based on research I did for a book that's just come out called A Perfect Frenzy, A Royal Governor, His Black Allies, and the Crisis That Spurred the American Revolution. So this book really, I think, provides a new way of understanding the beginning of the Revolution. Most of us know a lot about what happened in New England, but very few of us, I think, have delved into the dynamics of what was happening in Virginia. And remember, without Virginia's vote for independence in May of 1776 and its insistence that the Continental Congress also embrace independence, it is very likely there would be no United States. There would have been no unification without the most important, largest, most populous colony pushing for that. And the reason that the white gentry in Virginia pushed for independence was not simply to gain liberty, but it was also to try and neutralize Dunmore. The idea that he would emancipate, that he would provide liberty to Black Virginians was something that the white patriots simply were not able to stomach. And they realized that there was no hope in negotiating with Britain at that point. They needed independence. And sadly, most of our white patriot founders had no intention of freeing enslaved people. And in fact, of course, we know after the Revolution, things only got worse for those who were Black who lived in the South. So I think this story paints a more nuanced and interesting and more complicated, and I think much more fascinating picture about the dynamics of the early American Revolution.
Andrew Lawler, thank you for joining us.
I enjoyed chatting with you, Brady.